Tonight, Memorial Day in America. The president honors the fallen and pays special tribute to Vietnam veterans.
Came home and sometimes were denigrated when you should have been celebrated.
Gas prices are heading down and consumer confidence is up. Jim Axelrod on the prospects for an economic recovery this summer. The massacre of civilians in Syria. Why can't the world stop the killing? Elizabeth Palmer and Bob Orr report. And Brian Rooney with the story of fallen heroes lost during World War II and found nearly 7 decades later.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. Scott is off. I'm Anthony Mason. This Memorial Day, many Americans are enjoying a day of leisure, cookouts and parades shared with friends and family. But we've never forgotten the men and women who paid for the freedom we enjoy this day. Ceremonies honoring America's war dead were held across the country, including 2 led by the Commander-in-Chief.
Freeze and cut!
President Obama began the day on hallowed ground, Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, where he laid a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns. During the ceremony, the president noted that for the first time in 9 years, no Americans are fighting in Iraq, and that the end of fighting was also near in Afghanistan.
After a decade under the dark cloud of war, we can see the light of a new day on the horizon.
The president and the first lady also made a rare visit to the Vietnam Memorial and honored another generation who fought in a deeply unpopular war.
Even though some Americans turned their back on you, you never turned your back on America.
More than 58,000 names are etched into the memorial, and today the president pledged to renew the search for the 1,666 Americans still missing from the Vietnam War. Only 2 other sitting presidents have spoken at the Vietnam Memorial, Presidents Reagan and Clinton. The U.S. stock markets were closed for Memorial Day. In Europe, trading was mixed, despite fears that the continent could be headed for a new financial crisis. That could put the brakes on the U.S. recovery. But as Jim Axelrod reports, all signs point to a strong summer.
It's heating up on the boardwalk in Ocean City, New Jersey. And vacationers Tim and Tina Schmeltzley aren't talking about the thermometer.
I just think financially, this summer we feel we're a little bit better off than we were a year ago.
They're not alone. Consumer confidence is now at its highest since October 2007, 2 months before the recession started, which might help explain the crowd inside Shriver's Saltwater Taffy and Fudge.
Everything is going okay.
Meryl Van Geloff is the owner.
All the retailers tend to talk to one another. Everybody has had a very strong attitude thinking about how the summer is going to be this year for us all.
The optimism is easy for Van Geloff to explain. She's no economist, but she is a driver.
It's great to see that the gas prices are going to be helping people out. They'll come down and they can have a better time. They can do more things, hopefully, that they might not have been able to do before.
Normally, gas prices rise heading into the Memorial Day weekend. But this year, they've fallen 18 cents in the past month. The average price for a gallon of unleaded nationwide is now $3.64. Bruce Kasman is an economist for J.P. Morgan Chase.
Well, when gas prices go up at the pump, it immediately affects the ability of households to use their income to buy other goods and services. And you can look at fall as being a reversal, a tax cut that comes back and helps lift purchasing power.
Another big boost for consumer confidence is an improving job outlook. Although unemployment is 8.1%, that's the lowest level since January 2009. We'll find out if the job market has picked up even more momentum when the Labor Department releases its labor statistics for May, which, as you know, Anthony, will be this Friday.
Yeah, let's hope they're encouraging numbers. Thanks, Jim. Memorial Day was a washout in parts of the Deep South. Tropical storm Beryl made landfall today in Jacksonville, Florida. That city had not seen a major storm since the early 1960s. Tonight, Beryl has been downgraded to a tropical depression as it tracks north and east. Anna Werner is in Jacksonville.
Beryl hit the Jacksonville coast with top winds of 70 miles per hour, just short of a Category 1 hurricane. Waves grew fierce, streets flooded, and the winds downed trees. Some 40,000 customers lost power at the height of the storm. Jacksonville Mayor Alvin Brown urged residents to stay indoors.
We remain vigilant and heavily engaged in keeping Jacksonville residents safe.
Direct damage and flooding from Beryl was not as bad as feared. Much of the rain had been soaked up by ground parched from a 6-month drought. But the storm spoiled Jacksonville's plans for the annual Jazz Fest. Officials here estimate tourism losses at $20 million. Even after the storm passed, volunteer rescuers like Aaron Skipper had to watch the beach to keep people out of the water.
They should definitely stay out of the water. It's dangerous, there's a heavy current.
But in other places like Charleston, overcast conditions didn't scare off beachgoers. And for some tourists, Beryl proved a draw. Scotty Moore and Carrie Canales drove to Jacksonville from their home in Georgia just for the experience.
We rode into a storm and enjoyed every minute of it, and I almost want to do it again.
Over the next 48 hours, Beryl is expected to bring wind and rain to areas of southern Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And Anthony, forecasters then expect that later in the week, it will spin back out to sea.
Anna Warner in Florida. Thanks, Anna. In Afghanistan, 3 NATO service members were killed this Memorial Day, 2 in a helicopter crash in the east. The 3rd died in an enemy attack in the south. The situation in Syria took an ominous turn over the weekend when more than 100 people were massacred in the small town of Hula. Many of the victims were children. Syrians rose up against the Assad regime 14 months ago. The UN says more than 9,000 civilians have been killed in the fighting. So what happens next? We have 2 reports, beginning with Elizabeth Palmer.
A mass grave was the only way for the villagers of Hula to cope with 108 bodies as they arrived singly or in groups for burial. 49 of them, said the United Nations, were children. These shocking images prodded the UN back into action, and today Kofi Annan, the man whose peace plan is so visibly failing, arrived in Damascus for official talks.
Those responsible for these brutal crimes must be held to account.
But how? By the time UN military observers arrived in Hula on Saturday, the massacre was over. Frantic local witnesses told them on Friday afternoon President Assad's troops shelled their villages, and then gangs of thugs went house to house, killing. Syria's government said the killers were terrorists. Survivors insist they were government militiamen. Today, all eyes were on Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, for a sign that Russia, Syria's last major ally, would at last join calls for President Assad to step down. But it didn't come. It's completely unimportant who's in power in Syria, he said. The most important thing for us is to support an end to the violence. Easy to say. But as Britain's foreign secretary made clear, there are no fresh ideas on how to do it.
The alternatives are the Annan plan or ever-increasing chaos in Syria and a descent closer and closer to all-out civil war and collapse.
The massacre in Hula is evidence, if any more was needed, that descent is well underway.
Elizabeth Palmer joins us now from London. Elizabeth, what is the international community doing to put more pressure on Assad?
Well, Anthony, the next step is Kofi Annan, who's going to meet with President Assad tomorrow and urge him to prove that he wants a peaceful resolution to this crisis. But of course, his critics, both inside and outside Syria, say, look, it's already very clear that he doesn't.
Liz Palmer in London. Thanks, Liz. The violence in Syria has become an issue in the presidential campaign. Republican Mitt Romney said this weekend the U.S. ought to take steps to arm the Syrian opposition. The Obama administration has so far refused to do that. So what can be done to stop the killing? We asked Bob Orr to look into that.
The wave of weekend killings in Syria was condemned today by America's top military officer. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Martin Dempsey
The events in Syria over the weekend are just horrific, atrocious, really. I expect that the international community, that pressure will mount.
But pressure so far has failed to budge Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who's ignored repeated calls from President Obama to step down.
It is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition. It is time for that regime to move on.
International economic sanctions are biting hard. Syria's oil minister estimates his country has lost $4 billion in the 9 months since the sanctions took effect. The U.S. is also supplying humanitarian aid and communications gear aimed at helping the opposition groups who are battling Assad's forces. But the U.S. has not provided weapons to the rebels. And while direct U.S. military intervention remains an option, there's no sign it's imminent.
We'll be prepared to provide options if asked to do so.
For now, the U.S. is left with the UN peace plan, but there are big problems. The ceasefire is not holding, and the plan does not explicitly call for Assad to leave. Now, the Obama administration says there's no disconnect at all between its calls for Assad to leave and the UN plan, which could give him an opening to stay. Officials argue any genuine transition that addresses all of the needs of the Syrian people, Anthony, would result in Assad's ouster.
Thank you, Bob. An Air Canada flight bound for Tokyo had to make an emergency landing today when an engine shut down just after it took off in Toronto. There are reports that small pieces of metal debris, possibly from the engine, fell from the plane and smashed through a car window. Nobody was hurt on the ground, and the plane landed safely after dumping fuel. Scandal at the Vatican. Does it go higher than the Pope's butler? Radiation from the crippled Japanese nuclear plant shows up in bluefin tuna. And Marines and their families drank contaminated water at their base. Now they're fighting for benefits. When the CBS Evening News continues. For 30 years, Marines and their families drank contaminated water at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Today, many have cancer and other illnesses they blame on that water. Now, they're battling the Veterans Administration for disability benefits. Mark Strassman reports the Marines face an uphill fight.
That's my boot camp graduation picture.
Where's you?
My God, there I am.
Wow.
Yeah.
Frank Rakowitz served 26 years in the Marines. He was stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina between 1977 and 1986, when the water on base was toxic. Rakowitz now has stage 4 kidney cancer.
In what ways did you think you were exposed?
Well, took showers aboard the base, drank water aboard the base on a daily basis, so it was obvious to me I was a prime candidate for someone who had been, poisoned by the drinking water aboard Camp Lejeune.
Fuel and chemicals had seeped into Camp Lejeune's primary water system for 30 years. The Navy shut down the wells in 1987. Multiple environmental studies by the Navy, EPA, and Congress have concluded the water was highly contaminated. Chemicals like benzene, PCE, and TCE were as high as 280 times the level considered healthy. The Federal Agency for Toxic Substances says those chemicals can cause leukemia, bladder, kidney, and breast cancer.
What's the status of the cancer now?
Right now, I have incurable, inoperable cancer. I'm terminal.
Rakowitz filed a claim with the Veterans Administration to designate his cancer as a service-related illness. That would provide his wife, Ruth, with an extra $1,100 a month in survivor benefits.
And I want to make sure she's taken care of when I'm gone.
And that's the number one worry.
That's my number one worry.
The VA has denied 75% of these claims. 1,200 more cases are pending. No one with a VA would go on camera. But a department statement said scientific and clinical evidence is not sufficient to establish a presumptive association between service at Camp Lejeune and any subsequent development of particular diseases.
The doctor who told me I was terminal in November said without a doubt that this is what caused your cancer. He was convinced, and he wrote me the linking letter.
The letter that linked Rakowitz's cancer to his exposure at Camp Lejeune convinced the VA. On February 22nd, his claim was approved, but he worries about sick Marines still waiting.
You would like to think that their #1 priority would be taking care of the troops, and that's what I always believed happened.
Congressional reports estimate Frank Rakowitz was one of nearly 1 million Marines and their family members who drank Camp Lejeune's toxic water. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Jacksonville, North Carolina.
Researchers at the National Academy of Sciences said today that bluefin tuna along the California coast contain levels of radioactive cesium 10 times higher than normal. The radiation came from nuclear power plants crippled by the Japanese tsunami. It was carried by the tuna 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Scientists say the tuna is still safe to eat. The Pope's butler is under arrest. Will this Vatican scandal expand even further? That's next. The inquiry in the phone hacking scandal continues in London, and today it was former Prime Minister Tony Blair's turn to testify. He was interrupted by a protester condemning Britain's involvement in Iraq.
The man is a war criminal!
Blair admitted his government avoided scrutiny of Rupert Murdoch's media empire, fearing bad press as retaliation. A scandal that has rocked Vatican City threatened to expand today. Pope Benedict's butler is under arrest, but few believe that he is the sole source of the leaks that have exposed corruption and double dealing inside the leadership of the Catholic Church. Charlie D'Agata has more.
At the center of the holy whodunit is Paolo Gabriele, the Pope's personal butler. Since he was arrested last week on suspicion of stealing confidential documents, rumors have swirled that he must have had some high-ranking help, perhaps as high as the so-called princes of the church, the cardinals. Marco Tossati covers the Vatican for one of Italy's biggest newspapers.
If Paolo Gabriele has acted as he did, well, probably there was somebody very important who convinced him to do it.
Today, the Vatican denied that any cardinal was under investigation, but the scandal shows no sign of slowing. The butler pledged that he'd cooperate fully with investigators, raising the specter that he would name others. Gabriele, a father of 3, has worked for the Pope since 2006 and is one of the few laymen to have access to the Pope's private apartment. He's accused of leaking letters and memos to Italian journalists that allegedly show corruption in the church's financial dealings with Italian businesses, including money laundering and kickbacks. The revelations are part of a number of embarrassing leaks that show the church and its inner workings in disarray. For the moment, Paolo Gabriele is the lone arrest, and if found guilty, he could face up to 30 years in prison. Charlie D'Agata, CBS News, London.
Some fallen heroes finally come home, nearly 7 decades later. Their story is next. "83,000 Americans who fought and died overseas are still missing. Their remains never recovered. Until recently, that group included 7 Marine aviators lost in 1944 over a chain of islands in the Pacific. Brian Rooney has the story of how these heroes were finally brought home.
Second Lieutenant Walter Vincent's journey to a Tulsa cemetery took 68 years and the help of people who never knew him. Among them, Craig Anderson, who is married to Vincent's niece.
I guess just the not knowing, I just wanted to know.
The mystery of Vincent's disappearance began to unravel in 1998 when Ned Wernick, who was in the same B-25 squadron, helped restore another plane. It was painted with the same serial number as a B-25 that crashed in a South Pacific storm the night of April 22, 1944, the plane carrying Walter Vincent and 6 other men.
It brought tears in my eyes when I saw the thing come in. It got me wondering whether or not those bodies were still out there.
The wreckage had been found weeks after the crash on the island of Vanuatu, but the crew's families were mistakenly told the plane had been lost at sea. Wernick discovered the error and identified the crash site on a remote mountainside. He began a search for families of the lost men that led him to Craig Anderson and his wife, Kim.
I can remember vividly thinking, if this is that plane, if I have found this plane, I'm just going to have to go see it.
And you laughed.
Yeah, I laughed when he first told me that too.
In 2007, they flew to Vanuatu, recruited native guides, and hacked through underbrush up the mountain.
All of a sudden, about 10 feet in front of my face, I saw this propeller. I looked down and I was standing on debris. It was thrilling.
Among wheels and gears, military forensic teams eventually found bones from all 7 of the aircrew. After DNA identification, the remains finally were released, including those of the plane's gunner, Wayne Erickson. He was buried in Dallas last Thursday, just 2 weeks after Vincent's funeral in Tulsa.
Why is it so important to bring back anything after all this time?
To honor them. They honored us by going out and fighting for us, and it seems the least we could do.
Some family members say Walter Vincent's mother used to hope he would be found alive on an island, but they bought a burial plot for him back in the 1940s. It was waiting all these years for him to come home. Brian Rooney, CBS News, Dallas.
And that's the CBS Evening News for this Memorial Day. For Scott Pelley, I'm Anthony Mason. Thanks for watching. Good night.